Thank you, everybody, for being here. Really excited to have Kori with us today. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another edition of our Scientists and Strategists series. I'm Audrey Kurth-Cronin, Trustees Professor of Security and Technology, Director of the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology, or CMIST for short. At CMIST, we focus on the smart development, use, and governance of emerging technologies that are reshaping the landscape of war and peace. This speaker series is an opportunity for scientists and engineers to come together with strategists and policymakers for in-person discussions that enrich our understanding of their groundbreaking work. Over the course of this series, we've examined topics ranging from nuclear deterrence to the role of technology firms in shaping geopolitics. Today, we're turning our attention to a critical issue in the United States, American civil-military relations. Recent events have thrust civil-military relations into the national spotlight, raising critical questions about the balance of power, the role of American armed forces in a democratic society, and how policymakers can navigate these challenges while preserving the integrity of our institutions. To guide us through this discussion, we're honored to welcome Dr. Kori Schake, a well-known and leading expert on U.S. foreign and defense policy. Dr. Schake is a senior fellow and the director of the Foreign and Defense Policy at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., where she leads research on military strategy, defense policy, and national security. And prior to Dr. Shake's work at AEI, she served as Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London and has held high-level roles across the U.S. government, including at the State Department, the Department of Defense, and the National Security Council at the White House. Of note, she was also Foreign and Defense Policy Advisor to the 2008 McCain-Palin campaign for president. Beyond her policy work, Dr. Schake is a prolific scholar and author of 5 books, including Safe Passage, The Transition from British to American Hegemony, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2017. It explores a historically rare, peaceful transfer of global power in the international system. And also of particular relevance to us today is her 2016 book, Warriors and Citizens, American Views of Our Military, which Dr. Schake co-edited with General Jim Mattis. She's also a respected voice in public discourse, contributing regularly to The Atlantic, War on the Rocks, and Bloomberg, where she analyzes defense and foreign policy issues with clarity and depth. With a PhD and MA in Government and Politics from the University of Maryland, as well as an MPM from the University of Maryland School of Public Policy and a bachelor's from Stanford University, Dr. Schake combines academic rigor with real-world experience. So she not only talks about the theory, but she knows what's involved in implementing it, which is extremely important. Dr. Schake combines that academic rigor with real-world experience to offer a nuanced perspective on today's topic. And there are 2 additional developments that I want to bring to your attention. Firstly, Dr. Schake has just been named to the Kluge Chair at the Library of Congress, which is an enormous honor. So let's give her a round of applause. And I think you're working on another new book there, is it? Or is it additional work on the one that's coming out in September?
No, it's a really fun book on the lost art of winning wars.
Wow, okay. I can't wait to read it. Get to work. No, that's really great. That sounds like a wonderful topic. But I also want to mention that Kori Schake has a book coming out in September. So this is a very prolific writer. I'm jealous. This is wonderful. The book is called The State and the Soldier, and it's all about civil-military relations. It's coming out with Polity Press in this year, in September. So we're truly fortunate to have her here with us today at CMIST to discuss how both military and political leaders can collaborate to preserve and strengthen the relationship that is so critical to the security and stability of our American Republic, as well as our institutions now and into the future. So please join me again in welcoming Dr. Kori Schake.
So as Professor Kurth Cronin mentioned, you have stumbled into the subject on which I have just finished writing a book. So I'm sorry, but I am up to here in civil military relations in America right now. So let me make a couple of points about the book. First, what got me writing it was most of us who work on civil military relations are political scientists, and we write at the postgraduate level for each other. And there wasn't a basic history that tries to explain to people who don't spend all of their time thinking about this issue how it is that a country founded in fear of a standing army has come to think of our military as a major bulwark of democracy in this country. And so I tell that story, and it starts with George Washington, and it's really important that it starts with George Washington because there is no other country. In fact, there hasn't been another country in 1,000 years that has had a military this powerful, this prominent, this popular, this influential in policymaking that has never been a threat to the government. And what I learned writing the book is that the founding fathers actually had it backwards. They worried that a standing army in our country would be a threat to democracy. And it's actually once you have a standing military, starting in the American Civil War, that you stop having charismatic military leaders exceeding their political instruction. So before that, you have Alexander Hamilton with the new army. You have James Wilkinson, Thomas Jefferson's chief of staff of the army, who was a Spanish agent the entire 12 years. He was the senior military officer in the United States, and he was central to the Aaron Burr plot. You have Andrew Jackson invading Florida and putting the president in constitutional difficulty with the Congress because there was no declaration of war, and risking war with both England and Spain. So the second chapter of the book is the bad examples chapter. But I start with Washington for a reason, because of all of George Washington's many contributions to the United States, none is more important than the insistence he had throughout his time in service that the American military was unquestionably subordinate to the American Congress. There were, at the time of the Revolution, only two national institutions, the Continental Army and the Continental Congress. And it is because of Washington. He never demands, he pleads. He never gets the resources he believes he needs to carry out his strategy, so he changes his strategy to something consistent with the resources the Continental Congress can provide. And he resigns his commission before seeking public office, another important precedent. But I think the most important moment of the Washington example is in 1783. It's called the Newburgh Conspiracy. So American politicians have been using the military for partisan political advantage since the very beginning. In 1783, Alexander Hamilton is in the Continental Congress, and he and Robert Morris are trying to get the Congress to vote itself revenue-raising powers. And he encourages a mutiny by Washington's army to march on Congress in Philadelphia and demand pay and pensions. He appeals to Washington to lead this, and Washington beautifully warns him, refuses to do it, warns him an army is a very dangerous instrument to play with, and goes back to Newburgh. And the way we tell the story is incredibly romantic, right? That Washington sees this emergent mutiny, and he asks to see their demands of Congress, fumbles putting his glasses on, and says, "I have grown old and nearly blind in service of this republic." And that shames the mutineers. And it's true that Washington does say that, but that telling of the story skips over the two most important pieces of Washington's example. First, he doesn't stumble onto a mutiny. He calls the mutineers together as a good order and discipline measure. He stations 6'6", 240-pound Major General Henry Knox at the door to take into custody for court-martialing any officer who won't sign an oath of loyalty to the Continental Congress. And the second great thing he does is he sets the example that Congress doesn't have to be good at their job to merit our military being subordinate to them. He openly acknowledges Congress is terrible at what they're doing. They are serving us badly. That doesn't matter. That the American military subordination is about who we are as a military, not who Congress is as a legislature. And that rings down through the ages. I want to quickly tell one other story from the book because it's the most difficult moment in the history, in the 250 years of American civil military history. And that's in 1866 and 1867. General Grant is what we would now think of as the senior military officer. And he has to choose between whether to support which of the constitutionally authorized sources of civilian supremacy over the military to obey. Here's what happens. So President Lincoln had a particularly close and affirming relationship with his military leadership. Now, he had to fire a bunch of people to get there, right? Winfield Scott, Henry Halleck, George McClellan. But by the time you get the leadership team of Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, Farragut, everybody understands what the president wants. And what the president wanted at the end of the war was incredibly generous treatment to the Confederates. He wanted them to go home and obey the law and thought that the best way for that to happen was incredibly indulgent and excusing behavior. After President Lincoln's assassination, that changes in the civilian leadership. And you get a president, Andrew Johnson, who vacillates wildly on the issue, but ends up quite supportive of the reestablishment of the social, political, and economic structures that had existed under the Confederacy in the formerly seceded states. And that creates enormous friction for him with the Congress and with the remaining members of President Lincoln's cabinet, especially Secretary of War Stanton. Congress impeaches the president over it and is threatening to have him arrested. The president is threatening to have Congress disbanded. Congress passes a law saying the president cannot fire the Secretary of War. The president fires him anyway and appoints Grant while on active duty as both the senior general and the civilian Secretary of War. Grant accepts the role because he thinks he's buying time for the political process to play itself out. Congress threatens him with a 5-year prison sentence and a $10,000 fine. President Johnson offers to do the prison time if Grant will remain in the job. So Grant has to choose who to obey. And I think it's really important that when the president and the Congress were in the greatest era of friction other than the secession crisis, that Grant chose to obey the law, not to obey the commander-in-chief. And that feels I regret to say, strangely relevant for our moment. And maybe I'll stop there, Audrey.
I can't wait to read your book. That sounds, I mean, those are stories I knew about Washington, but not so much after the Civil War and Andrew Johnson. That's fascinating.
I didn't know it either.
Wow.
This is the benefit of writing books. You actually learn important stuff.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for sharing it with us. So you transitioned into thinking about today and the degree to which the law continues to guide us in how our institutions behave, and especially the military behaves. Do you think we're right now in a civil-military relations crisis?
I do not. I think that there are three important guidelines for American civil-military relations. The American military takes its oath to the Constitution. They are subordinate to both the chief executive and to the Congress. So it's really not more complicated than that. The president can fire anybody he wants, and the military lets it happen because everybody in the senior ranks serves at the pleasure of the president. Right? President Obama fired General McKiernan, General McChrystal, who else? Oh, Jim Mattis. Right? And at least in Jim's case, there probably hasn't been a military leader that popular among the rank and file in a while, at least. And not only did nobody in uniform bat an eye, I happened to talk to Jim on the day he was fired, and he was looking forward to sleeping in for the first time in 42 years. And appreciated that everybody serves at the pleasure of the president. So I think the two important tests of civil-military relations are, can the president fire anybody with impunity? And the American military clearly passes that test. And the second important test is, will the military carry out policies they don't agree with? And I think the military leadership has had significant reservations about every major policy of the last 23 years and carried them out without a murmur. And so, no, I don't think we're anywhere near a crisis in civil-military relations.
All right, well, that's reassuring, because it feels like there's crisis all over the place. So that's good.
Yes, it does.
It does. All right, well, let me ask you about the relationship between the military and society. The Reagan Foundation every year comes up with a survey. I'm sure you're very familiar with all these statistics. Public trust in the American military dropped from 70% in 2018 to a low of 45% in 2021, and it's now bumped up a bit, but it's still low at 51%. So why do you think trust in the institution is declining, and how do you think that affects civil-military relations even in the short run or the long run?
Yeah. So when Jim and I were writing Warriors and Citizens, we had YouGov do the largest surveys that had been done in 20 years of those kinds of attitudes. And it was really striking to realize the reason the American public loves their military actually has very little to do with winning or losing wars. And it bears out in the Reagan poll. You see the consistency of public support until just recently. Mostly the reason the American public loves their military is that because of the 1873 Posse Comitatus Act, the only time they have much to do with their military is when they're fighting wildfires, helping people in natural disasters, right? So the fact that our military is not involved in law enforcement, watch this space, really matters to the public's relationship with the military. And the second thing is, our military is a conveyor belt into the middle class. It's a path to education, it's a path to opportunity, it's a path to skill development. And the public really values that about our military because there aren't so many other obvious conveyor belts into the American middle class. My theory of why, well, I dug into the data actually, and I cited in the book. There are two reasons that public trust in the military has dropped. And one is that some in the military leadership have been behaving in ways that invite civilian censure. And I think General Milley is in the forefront of this. And the example I would say is that, nobody in the military knows a thing about critical race theory. Let's be honest, right? Like, it's an obscure law professor kind of thing. But when in the hearing, when the subject came up, it was the civilian defense secretary who got asked. And the right thing for somebody in uniform to do when a hot button political issue gets asked of a civilian is hide behind the suit. Because Mark Milley couldn't resist the temptation to show off his Princeton education and went into a long disquisition. Now every 2-star and above who goes up for confirmation has to answer the question of what their view is on critical race theory, something irrelevant to the American military, and which everybody has to be coached to find a pathway that will hopefully not prevent their confirmation for what they are being promoted to serve the country on. The main reason, though, is the disgraceful behavior of my fellow Republicans of going after the American military as somehow unpatriotic, as somehow obsessed with diversity rather than trying to do good work for the country. And the way that Republicans, and in particular Donald Trump, has talked about the military as the generals always wanting to go to war, being corrupt, all of that stuff is actually, you can track it in time. And that's the biggest reason for the dip in public support for the military.
That's really interesting. So I was going to ask you, sorry, Kori, I was going to ask you about why trust in the military, specifically among Republicans, has gone down, because that's been most surprising. And you think that's why?
Absolutely, it's why.
Oh. All right, well, let's go back and revisit a few of the things that you said watch this space. Posse Comitatus has a lot of exceptions, and the Insurrection Act has been forwarded as a way that our current administration can use American troops at the border, active American troops, not just logistics, but actually going after people and playing the role of law enforcement, essentially, I guess, at the border. So does that not concern you, especially given this great history that you've laid out to us and that you've written about in your book? Is this a new thing, or do you think it's a good idea for the American military, the active American military, to be policing the border?
So it's not a new thing. Presidents Obama, Trump, and Biden all sent regular troops to the border. The proper solution to this problem is immigration and border control.
Yeah.
Right? The proper solution to this problem isn't saying the only people with any capacity to solve this problem are the American military. And it will change the public's relationship with the military if the military is involved in law enforcement. I'm actually quite worried about, once pictures start coming out about deportation flights where people are in shackles and the military's involved, I very much worry about how that's going to affect public support for the American military. But I should also say, on the other side of the equation, border control is the most popular political issue in the country. People are genuinely concerned about it. And to my mom, she wouldn't actually understand why we spend $878 billion a year on a military that has 2 million people in it, and it doesn't guard our borders, right? The logic of that isn't apparent to people who don't spend their time thinking about it. And so if you care about civil-military relations, you should also care about us getting legislation that actually takes pressure off of the southern border, because it's going to be bad for civil-military relations if we push our military into being a major part of the solution to this problem, much less the military helping round people up for it. in cities around the American country, which one of the things that keeps me up at night is the president declaring a national emergency over immigration and thereby enabling use of the military to go into elementary schools in this country and pick up kids they want to deport.
Okay, I'd like to go back and talk about the traditional image that Americans have.
Sorry, one other thing I should have said.
Yep, go ahead.
About 20 American presidents out of, 47 now, have used the American military for domestic law enforcement, mostly for strike breaking. Minor strikes are the, but it was all pre-1950. Since 1950, the only domestic uses of the American military are when a governor has requested it, the LA riots in 1992, or to enforce civil rights, constitutional civil rights protections, right? Eisenhower did it, Kennedy did it, LBJ did it. So there's a very positive side to domestic use of of the American military for law enforcement, but that's not what we're talking about now.
On the question of the relationship between the military and society, you were referring to how it's been seen as a kind of a conveyor belt from the lower class. Or my own dad was from a very poor family, 9 children, and quite
Ends up an admiral, if I'm not
yes,
mistaken.
that's true. So he was always very proud of the fact that he was able to start from nothing, and just from hard work and merit, and being very persistent, and there's always a considerable amount of luck too, but he worked his way up in the U.S. Navy, and that was the most important guiding principle for my family as we grew up. The importance of merit and how the U.S. military is a great merit-based organization. Then, we've gone through these 2 wars for 20 years, Iraq and Afghanistan, and I sense a kind of a distance between the civilian world and our military who were serving in repeated deployments. I mean, because I was teaching at the National War College, and so you would get people coming right back from combat and feeling quite alienated in many ways from a society that didn't care that they were in combat, and perhaps they had lost people, and perhaps they were injured themselves. So there was a sense, I'm not talking about statistics, I'm talking about my sense from working with members of the military for over many years, that there was a divergence happening in our country. And the other thing that has been documented is that certain families tend to send people to the military, and it's not evenly divided, it's not evenly spread out over American society. So the all-volunteer force is not necessarily a full reflection of our American society.
It's true.
So how has that affected civil-military relations now compared to a time, say, when George Washington was looking at the role of the Army?
So since the professionalization, since the start of the volunteer force in 1973, the choice not to conscript Americans has skewed that.
Yes.
70% of recruits into the American military come from the southern and western United States. There are very few even recruiting stations on the eastern seaboard because they produce so few recruits. And so with recruiting money tight, they focus where the recruits come from, which of course
Perpetuates things.
perpetuates it.
Yeah.
And it is now less true in the last few years that serving men and women in the armed forces are encouraging their children to join.
Really?
In part because of the pace of deployments. So we have chosen to have a force small for the strategy we are carrying out, and that has costs on the people who bear it. Jim Madison and I just wrote a chapter for a book Mackenzie Eaglin is editing on how to recruit the force that we need, which is why I know all the statistics on it. And we need a bigger Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps if we are going to continue to do the things that we are doing. Because what we are asking, and your point about the civil-military gap about that, if any of you haven't read Phil Clyde's book of short stories, it's titled Redeployment. It's a really good book, and it gets at the texture that you are talking about. I do think one of President Bush's biggest mistakes after September 11th was not asking for societal sacrifice and contribution, because I think it is a general sense among folks in the military that for 23 years we weren't a country at war, we were just a military at war.
Yes, that I heard that from them. Yes, very true. Well, how are we going to get ourselves out of that situation? Are you in favor of a draft or some kind of American service, or what? Do you think there's a solution that's better than some of the papering over that we've been doing?
I don't think there's an easy solution to this, because a conscripted force is the cohort of 18 to 25-year-olds in the United States is 32 million people.
So demographics.
So unless you want a federal workforce of 32 million additional people, which I could see a good argument for national parks, fixing the potholes in my street. But my two nephews are probably going to go across the border to Canada rather than fix those potholes, which brings up the point that the real problem with conscription, in addition to the fact that unless it is universal, it's inherently unfair.
Yeah.
Is the fact that you bring enormous problems of good order and discipline when you have people who don't want to be there, right? And part of the reason the American military is so proficient is because the people who are in it want to be there and have good reasons to want to be there. So it streamlines the doing of it. I mean, I think it's no mystery that the great writers of military satire were in the conscripted American military, right? Joseph Heller, those guys.
True. And I remember the Vietnam War.
In fact, the meanest thing ever said about the American military was written, who wrote the Caine Mutiny? Herman Wouk, maybe? Mm-hmm. Who fought in World War II. And he says, the United States Navy was designed by geniuses to be run by idiots. If you want to know how to do something in the Navy, think of how would a stupid person do this, and do it that way, because that's how the Navy's designed.
Okay. Well, that's a great movie, though, The Caine Mutiny. I strongly recommend it to you all if you haven't seen it. I've seen it about 18 times. All right. Well, so we have put in place other ways to improve our recruitment situation. I have statistics somewhere in here too about the degree to which we no longer are able to recruit the number of people that we need, and it has gone up somewhat in the last year. But they're doing things like the Future Soldier program, because isn't it something like 25% of recruits, 23% I read, are incapable of passing the intelligence test and incapable of passing the physical tests because they're overweight or they're out of shape. And so now we put them through a pre-boot camp. And we're lowering our standards as well, particularly for these standardized tests. So that's one answer to get more people to be able to carry out this ambitious agenda. What do you think of that?
So I'm less worried about recruitment than most of my colleagues. Because I've been persuaded by the folks doing the recruiting that the biggest impediments are 3.2% unemployment. You can always see an inverse relationship between recruitment and the unemployment statistics. But the second is because of COVID, they couldn't be meeting people in person. And so I think the partial recovery you're seeing is actually a function of recruiters being able to meet people in person. The other thing I would say is that The Marine Corps is incredibly serious about recruiting. 40% of generals in the Marine Corps have done a recruiting tour. That's not true of the leadership of any of the other services. And it sends a cultural message in the institution that I think the other services would do well to consider for themselves. On the point about the future soldiers, so 25% of Army recruits come through this remedial program. 20% of the Navy's recruits come through this remedial program. It is worrisome that they are lowering some of the standards. But it is also the case that only 9% of young Americans meet the qualifications to enlist in the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps.
Wow.
And have a proclivity to do so. So I actually really favor these programs because they are widening the aperture of the recruit pool of kids who want to come into service but can't yet qualify. And if we're willing to put people through remedial programs in order to bring them into the service academies, which we do in large numbers, I think we ought to be willing to do it for young women and young men who want to be soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. That's not to say we should be lowering the standards. I'm only half kidding when I say the solution to this problem is that the next Democratic president is going to make Ozempic and other weight loss drugs part of the remedial training program, and we'll get through it just fine.
Oh, that's shocking. Well, one of the things we think about here at Carnegie Mellon quite a lot is what will be the effect of technology, particularly artificial intelligence, related technology on the future of the workforce. So if you're looking at the relationship between recruitment and unemployment, I don't know, is that potentially a good thing? You're going to have people that are looking for employment and maybe they'll be available for military service?
So somebody who's a surgeon in the United States Navy doesn't meet the same standards as a pilot in the Navy or an infantryman in the Marine Corps. And I think for a lot of the kind of technological expertise that modern warfare is going to require, we need to think about specialized tracks for that. And some of the current restrictions, like restrictions on body art or having smoked dope when you were in high school, are so common in the tech community we want to recruit into the force as to be prejudicial. And so I think the role specialization that we see in lots of other areas of American life is already existing in the military. We're just not culturally comfortable with it. And we need to think about that in slightly different ways. We're so worried that admitting women into, the Navy SEALs is going to lower standards, that we don't think about the fact that we need to raise standards for hackers we are going to need in the force.
That's a good pivot point to what Secretary Hegseth has said about women serving in the military, and particularly women in combat. And he wants to review whether or not standards have been lowered in order to allow women to serve. And this is at a time when we need more people in the military and when we've got a very proud and strong history of women's honorable service. Suddenly we're very concerned about standards with respect to women, and yet we're overall lowering standards for the broader range of recruits that we're trying to grab at. So what's your thought about that?
So I am not Secretary Hegseth's biggest fan. I think it was a mistaken appointment. But I actually think this could be beneficial because given his misogynist views, when confronted with the data from the services about the standards women in the force meet and the 200,000 American women currently serving in the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps, I think he will be an ideal spokesman for defending that the standards are being met and that women benefit the force even assigned to combat units. Well, I think restoring the credibility after that dip, I mean, we need to make Republicans walk the plank on this because they're the ones who created the problem.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, as they say. Okay. What about President Trump's involvement he's overturned the results of courts-martials. He, of course, has said that he wants former JCS chairman Mark Milley to stand trial for treason, and he infers that he should be shot. He's also publicized plans to create boards of retired officers who will review active duty general officers for their wokeness. We've just seen today, at least I saw on CNN, that they've got a target list, which includes C.Q. Brown, the first African-American to serve as the head of his service, and now the second African-American to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's talking about going after Admiral Lisa Franchetti, the CNO of the Navy. I mean, is there no limit? I mean, your argument is that every general officer serves at the pleasure of the president, and I fully understand that. But is there any limit whatsoever if these kinds of decisions are made upon grounds that seem inappropriate?
So let me separate the firing off from the rest of those examples, because president can fire anybody they want. Everybody serves at the pleasure of the president. And a president the American people have elected deserves to have a military leadership he or she trusts, feels comfortable with, believes they can tell secrets to, and not have it reported in the New Yorker subsequently. Right? Like, it matters. Trust really matters in the American system at the top. And not one American in 10 million can tell you who Lisa Franchetti or C.Q. Brown is, and it will make no bigger blip on the radar screen than Jim Mattis getting fired. I think that's just a statement of fact. Everything else you mentioned, I genuinely worry about. What the president is doing. So, for example, they just appointed as a special assistant to the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, the Marine Colonel Stuart something, who was court-martialed, dishonorably discharged, and they have now brought him back as a senior civilian in the department. What the president is doing is interfering in the good order and discipline of the American military, and that is genuinely dangerous. And the signals he is sending of circumventing the senior leadership of the military to try and encourage the rank and file to have a personal loyalty to the president is a very dangerous thing. Allowing the retired generals who the president favors to make a judgment about whether Chris Donahue, who was the commander in Afghanistan, the last American soldier to leave the country, is deserving of leading American soldiers. That's a genuinely dangerous development. And the people who could and should stop that are the Congress of the United States, right? Article 1 of the Constitution gives all of those powers of regulating American defense establishment to the Congress, not to the president. That's the Grant example. The law takes precedence over the commander-in-chief in peacetime.
I've heard you say before that members of the military should obey any lawful order that the president gives them. but there's so much shifting on what is lawful, or at least the public perception of what is lawful. So are you going to be able to have members of the military who are able to consult their lawyers and get kind of quick feedback before they have to decide, or do you see any clash that might come?
You do not want Corporal Schake determining for herself whether the president's making good policy.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, that's so destructive of good order and discipline. The senior leadership of the military are the people who have lawyers and are the people who get to determine, the lawyers are the people who get to determine what's lawful. The American military is required to follow every lawful order. Nerds like me have a broad category that we call lawful but awful. And there's a lot of stuff in there, and we're going to see a lot of it in the coming 4 years. But there is a public misperception that the American military can and should not follow immoral orders. There is no such category in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You follow legal orders. You don't follow illegal orders. That's the only sorting that gets to happen. The only exception to that is if an airman, Marine, sailor, let's see, oh, I'm leaving out soldiers, believes they cannot in good conscience follow an order, they can resign. That's the only alternative. There's no navigate the center course and bring the president to a better place, nor in a free society should there be, right? There exist political solutions to these political challenges, and not only can the American military not save us from a bad president, you're not going to want a military that can or believes it should.
Our current president has claimed that whatever he says is by definition lawful. And there is a narrative, I'm not saying I'm endorsing it, that as commander-in-chief, and particularly one who has called himself a king yesterday, that pretty much anything that he would ask the military to do would be by definition lawful.
That's manifestly false, right? Like, it's not close to the line.
Where is Congress, Kori? Where is Congress?
I despair of my fellow Republicans in Congress exercising their Article I authorities, but we are only a month into this circus. And I think as the courts and political gravity begin to take hold, I don't despair that Congress will return to a place where it doesn't want the next president to have authorities that Congress should constitutionally exercise.
Again, I hope you're right.
Me too.
All right, I'm going to finish my asking of questions with one that relates to technology, because we are at Carnegie Mellon. And, the People's Republic of China has what it calls the military-civilian fusion in the development of technology. And of course, in the United States, the most innovative technologies advances have been happening in universities and in the private sector, not in the military anymore. So our talented scientists and engineers have a tendency now not to go into the military as they might have done in earlier decades, but instead to be going into private organizations, starting their own startups or getting engaged in advanced technological innovation in universities like ours. So don't you think that the fact that the military is no longer driving technological innovation and is seen as not being at the cutting edge is having an influence on civil-military relations and the eagerness of some of our brightest young people to join the military?
Yeah, but bright young people advancing technology at Carnegie Mellon is also good for the country. And so I think finding ways that the military is knowledgeable about what's going on in the civilian economy, and there are pathways for pulling technologies into the military. The biggest impediment to good technology in the military is the acquisition system in the Department of Defense.
Yes.
It's not that the military is not at the cutting edge, it's that the antediluvian practices of that Congress has layered like barnacles on a ship's hull just make it too hard, especially for small fleet companies that are at the cutting edge, to think it's worth their while to have the military as a customer. So that's the fix I would make, rather than conscripting all those smart Carnegie Mellon engineers into the military.
Good to know. But we got to get back to fixing Congress, Kori. That's what's going to fix the acquisition system ultimately.
Yes.
All right. I've enjoyed this conversation, and now I think we should give someone else a chance. So if you would like to ask a question, wait for the mic, and please tell us who you are. Go ahead, Nicole.
Hi, my name is Nicole Cleaver.
I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here, and I study civil military relations. And one of the patterns I've seen recently is a preponderance of parties bringing military service members that aren't currently serving, but using their image in a lot of partisan places. So having individuals run for office, for example, 50% of the individuals who ran as Republicans in 2022 actually had mentioned election denying, things like that that are happening. We saw leaders also jump in from the military and speak out against President Trump in vocal and public letters. And I'm curious your thoughts on these individuals who aren't currently serving but previously served, but using that weight in politics and how that affects both recruitment and also just views of civil military relations.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the other word for veterans is citizens. And so when they leave military service, they have the right to behave just as idiotically as the rest of us do in American political life. And they will continue to trade on their military service for as long as it is an electoral advantage, right? And politicians will continue. I mean, President Biden having uniformed Marines standing behind him in Philadelphia when he gives a end of democracy speech is terrible. And that's part of where this concern about politicization of the military. The best break on politicization of the military itself is the professionalism of the military. The veteran community is behaving like any other political action group because it's beneficial. The military could enforce the Uniform Code of Military Justice on retired senior officers, right? There, as of course you probably know, there was the big discussion about should Mike Flynn be court-martialed for his astonishingly corrosive behavior. But the problem is the first time you do it, it's going to look like it's politically directed. And so if I were advising the lawyers, I would say bring 12 people of both political parties up on UCMJ charges if you want to go this direction. My guess is they're never going to do that because mostly, I love Heidi Urban, Professor Urban from Georgetown. I love her saying that the longest running war the US military wishes it didn't have to fight is the culture war in the United States. But because they are such a valuable political volleyball, they're going to keep getting batted over the net. And my advice when I counsel senior folks is Clarence Darrow's, that great defense attorney's advice to his clients was, no man was ever convicted based on testimony he did not give. And so actually Jim Mattis, when civilian secretary, gave a great example of this, which he was asked, he was, talking to a group of soldiers and some journalist asked him, what do you think of football players taking a knee during the national anthem. And Jim did exactly the right thing that should be modeled by every serving officer, and I wish would become the norm for veterans, which is he got a wearied look on his face and said, I have a really difficult, demanding job. I'm not up to date on all of these issues, right? Like, hide behind the suits, let the pitch go by, don't swing at it. But veterans are a problem because they're American citizens.
Other questions?
Okay, I'll filibuster by saying the best description of Americans of all time was given by a British historian, Bertha Ann Reuter, in 1923, which is that Americans are a people so extreme in politics or religion or both that they could not live in peace where they came from. Right? That's the problem with American politics. Americans.
I'm curious about your thoughts on the service members side of the equation, right? So several people are the C-17 pilots that are flying people in shackles to these places, and it's testing a lot of people's oath, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times in civil military relations, we talk about how it impacts the civilian side, but we don't talk about how it impacts the military side. And it gets kind of old to hear that we're waiting on Congress to, advocate or, what it might be. I'm curious, question in the end here, what do you think the impact is going to be on the quality of service member or who decides to stay? Because our only choice is to resign. And so I think some of these actions, the lawfully awful orders, I think it's starting to maybe be situations like, I feel like maybe you don't think that there's issues with civil military relations, but on the military side, maybe kind of edging on a precipice of some of the hardest things people have had to choose to do.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't doubt that it is tugging at the conscience of a lot of folks, and that it will be determinative in whether they stay in the force or whether they come in the force. And it will bring probably a different kind of cohort into the force. Whether that makes our force better or worse, I'm not sure, to be honest. Because there are a lot of, this isn't the only unpleasant conscience-tugging thing that we ask our military to undertake on behalf of our broader society. And so I think there are a lot of those along the way for people, and we're likely to have a lot of them to come. So I think you're right. I think it's tearing at the fabric, but it's not the only hard thing that goes on, and it's not the only test of conscience that folks in service have.
Did you want to ask a follow-up, Heather?
No, I think it is what it is. The thing that's unfortunate is the service has you, earn a retirement through longevity of service. And so I think a lot of people don't have the flexibility of leaving or resigning without impacting their future and their family. But they've since ended, the legacy retirement system. And so all people who have joined 2018 and after are kind of a part of a 401k of sorts. And they're just starting to become middle senior kind of officers. And I'm really interested to see the difference, because off-ramps will be much easier to take here in the future.
Mm-hmm. So I was working in General Powell's staff in the early 1990s when we cut a third of the military. And because of the end of the Cold War, right? Creation of the base force. And what we saw then, what we worried then, was that the people you want to keep are the people who are going to leave. But the data was quite mixed, which is what makes me unsure about what the consequences of these kind of lawful but awful strains will be. I think everybody reaches a breaking point at some point, but also the military is not the only people having this experience, right? Lots of veterans who are federal government employees are having that experience right now. Lots of state employees, lots of researchers at the National Institutes of Health. I think it's a broader general problem, and the extent to which we segment people off as opposed to deal with it as a community of built. So let me say it differently. What I learned working for John McCain is that politics is a game of addition. And if we treat the military as too unique in this particular space, we make it easier to ignore what they are experiencing rather than generalizing it to others who are having similar and possibly related experiences.
Do you have anything to say about the tremendous pressure that's on federal public service right now? I mean, we're losing a lot of very talented people abruptly, but this is also having reverberations on other people that want to go into service for the country, including in the military, but also in many other kinds of agencies and organizations and parts of the federal government. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think reckless, whimsical destruction is bad for the country.
Yes, I agree. John? Mike? Here we go. Thank you, Danielle.
John Chan, assistant teaching professor here in CMIST. I study coups, among other things. So I think about civil-military relations in other contexts. And you've expressed several times that maybe you're not so concerned about firings per se as a crisis of civil-military relations. But I am wondering generally about your thoughts, I guess broadly speaking, sort of a loyalty competency trade-off, right, within the military. And so to the extent, right, it's important for a president to have generals that he trusts. On the flip side, right, we want competent, right, general officers and so on. So if Trump is selecting on loyalty, like what are the downstream sort of consequences as you see it?
Yeah, it's a great question, but you're right that I am not that concerned about that problem for two reasons. The first is that the bench strength of competence in the senior and mid-grade ranks of the American military is so vast that, you can keel haul the top 100 and still have an incredibly competent leadership. You could probably jettison the top 1,000 and still have an incredibly competent leadership team. So my confidence in the ability of the mid and senior ranks makes me less worried about that. The second thing, and I hate that I think this, but I do actually think this, it is, I think, unproven that the officers who would accept a loyalty test to the president will be worse at the competence than those who wouldn't. I think they may be unrelated phenomenon. I worry about the people who would pass the loyalty test, and I think it's incredibly dangerous and destructive for the administration to be giving it. But it's not clear to me that that's essential, that integrity and competence are co-influential. I wish I didn't think that, but I think it's as yet unproven. Right?
Dan.
Thanks. Hi, Dan Silverman. I'm an assistant professor here. Can you? Yeah, I
can hear you.
I think this is working. Probably enough to hear me, anyways. So thanks so much for coming. I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on. I know you have. We could push you into several different areas of expertise, but a little bit of the shifting landscape of foreign policy alignment in general. And so, we have this real, flowering movement of some would call isolationism under Trump and in the Republican Party. Do you see, how do you see the internationalist sort of wing of the Republican Party and the internationalist wing of the FP establishment in general. I mean, do you see a sort of realignment happening there where people are, that's flipping and people are flocking to the other party? Or there's also a strong sort of a resurgent parallel movement on the left. And, you know, I'm just curious from where you sit, how you see people navigating that. And I guess to make it not totally unrelated, does that relate to military officers who Nicole studies this are entering politics and where they maybe see their home and all that?
Yeah. So one of the downsides of having a small military relative to our population is that almost nobody knows anybody in the military. And we have a tendency to treat them like Marvel Comics superheroes or like people who couldn't get a job in a gas station, right? Like there's very little, hey, my next door neighbor's a single mother of two and she's a corpsman in the Navy and she's amazing. So that the polarization of public attitudes about the military means that we have assumed that veterans coming into politics is going to be beneficial and internationalist. And do you think that's true of Tom Cotton, of Lindsey Graham? I mean, what the American public is learning is that veterans populate the political and craziness spectrum of the rest of the country. They just happen to be working in a particular sector of the national security space. So the fact that somebody was, let's just take an example, a National Guard major for a few years doesn't necessarily mean he knows much about the American military. What the leadership of the American military is genuinely brilliant at is organization and logistics. They tend, almost all of them, to be internationalists because they understand that you get to the economy of scale that we need for the problems we're solving most cost effectively if other people pile in and help you do it. And that will put them at odds with the president, who, I gotta say, we may come to wish he was an isolationist rather than actively helping Russia and China achieve their objectives in the international system, which is what it looks like he's on a path to doing with Ukraine negotiations. On the foreign policy community more broadly, I think we are in the find out stage of fool around and find out. And there's a reason that the people who fought 2 world wars in their lifetimes built an international order of security guarantees, shared burdens, institutions in which those burdens were anchored, norms and patterns of predictable behavior, because that reduces the risk of wild vacillations that are dangerous. And I think we are in for very stormy seas because the administration clearly does not value that system and is actively working to instead establish a set of rules where America's preponderance of power comes to bear to get more advantageous rules for us than for others, which is actually exactly what Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are also trying to do in the international order. So to end on a personal note, I do sometimes feel like the last saber-toothed tiger thrashing around in the tar pit, but I do not despair that once we get a taste of what it feels like to have Canadians boo the American national anthem and Denmark think it has to protect itself from us, what that attitudes will change. And I actually have a little data to support that thrashing around in the tar pit optimism, which is that if you look at the annual polls by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, in 2016, when President Trump was elected, on his three major issues, that allies were a burden, that immigrants were taking American jobs, and that trade was exporting those jobs, there was a fair amount of support. I mean, it did get him elected. Within 2 years, public opinion had swung by more than 15% on all three of those issues. So in theory, it sounded fine. Once people saw the policies, their attitudes changed. And I am actually pretty confident, if you look at polls that the Wall Street Journal is running now, that attitudes are shifting very fast against the president when people see the policies.
I think we should end on that note. That's an optimistic note. Thank you so much, Kori.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Thanks.